2024 World News. I'm your host Josh Moon, bringing you today's biggest headlines. Tonight, updated surface from the Tianjin explosions a few months before. To discuss the causes of the explosion, we go over to leading chemical safety expert Bob Nixon. So, Bob, what was the underlying cause of this terrible event?
Well, first of all, this is a classic example of dangerous chemical chain reactions, and once that chain reaction starts, it's very difficult to get it under control. Second of all, we know that there was inadequate safety protocols in place on the plant, so a lot of damage was preventable if the Chemical Safety Board's recommendations had been followed.
This chain reaction, as you call it, how was it able to inflict so much damage, and is there still cause for concern in the areas around the site?
From what we understand, the fire started when nitro-cotton was allowed to dry up and self-ignite. Fire crews then arrived to spray water on the initial fire, but nearby calcium carbide reacts with water to become highly flammable. This then created an even larger fire, which then caused the tank of acetyl to explode with a force of about 3 tons of TNT. This was the first explosion. And this explosion caused the illegally stored ammonium nitrate to then explode with a force of about 21 tons of TNT. There is still cause for concern after the explosions, as there are reports of 700 tons of sodium cyanide on plant. This highly toxic chemical can be fatal if as little as 1 teaspoon is ingested, and when it burns, it forms poisonous hydrogen cyanide gas, which then can damage the surroundings.
So, what precautions should have been taken to have prevented as much of this as possible, and how can the locals stay safe now?
So to have prevented this incident in the first place, all fire crews in the local area should have been made aware of the chemicals on site and how to handle them should these events have happened. It is clear that water was not suitable to use in this instance. Instead, dry powder should have been used to extinguish the initial fire, and then sand should have been used to absorb the chemicals and clean away all of the mess. These chemicals also should have been stored as far away from each other as possible. For now, we recommend that a 1 kilometre radius around the site remain evacuated and that locals stick to drinking bottled water and not mains water, as that could be contaminated with the sodium cyanide.
Next we have Jay Zong, a fireman who was part of the initial emergency response. Can you tell us what happened during the build-up to the explosion?
We were brought in to fight a warehouse fire in the port, but when we tried to put it out using water, it just kept getting bigger and bigger until it erupted.
How much were you told about the fire?
We were told very little about the fire. We didn't know that there were chemicals stored in the warehouses.
And would you have known how to deal with the fire if you were informed correctly?
Most of us are just contract workers hired by the port, so we didn't know that you needed to use foam and sand to put out chemical fires.
So, finally, how was the fire contained?
After 10 hours of fighting the fire, we were relieved by the military. They brought in specialists for nuclear disasters to put out the fire and contain any possible spills.
It is Chinese law that dictates any companies involving dangerous chemicals are not permitted storage under 1 kilometre from any public building or transport network. 3 major residential areas were within the 1 kilometre proximity to the Wuhai warehouse. Several surviving residents who lived near the incident were left completely traumatised. Wang Fang was among the thousands of victims who lost their homes to the horrific blast. She now seeks financial compensation for injury, loss of home, and psychological trauma. Let's hear from her now.
The landlords of all these houses received government compensation, but people like me who were renting didn't get anything at all. I hate remembering what happened the night of the explosion, but I remember I'd gone to sleep early and the sound of the blast woke me. All my windows had been blown out. I ran outside immediately with no time to put shoes on. The sky was bright orange, I could smell burning and blood, and everyone was running away from the explosion. I was running barefoot on broken glass, and I couldn't walk properly for weeks. Everyone was screaming and crying, and we were all extremely traumatized from the experience. I had to go see a psychiatrist for a couple of months afterwards. My landlord, who lives almost 100 miles away in Beijing, sold the property without letting me know. And I was still recovering from my injuries at this point, and he only gave me a week notice to leave. He had received 400,000 renminbi compensation from the government, and he told me that I had nothing. I'm now living with a friend of mine, and I'm trying to go to court to argue for a share of the government compensation that was given to my landlord.
We've been able to secure an exclusive interview with the majority shareholder of Ruhai International Logistics, Yu Zhuai, after the trial day for his involvement in the company's warehouse explosion, killing over 100 people and injuring hundreds more. Mr. Yu, you've been accused of illegally building and running a warehouse filled with hazardous materials. How were you able to do this without the local government realising?
The short answer is that we weren't. As a former executive of the state company CEAM and being on the board for Tianjin Port Dangerous Goods Logistics Company, I was able to use these links and my political ties to get permission to build the warehouse so close to the local living areas.
According to the Xinhua report of the incident, your company was also running inept safety management and local officials in several departments had failed to enforce the regulations correctly. Was this also to do with your political connections?
That was more my partner's area, Dong Shewan, whose father was the police chief. Whenever we had issues with the police or needed a fire inspection, he would meet with the officials from the Tianjin Port Fire Squad. He would give them the files and immediately get appraisal.
And finally, what have the results been for your trial?
I have been handed a suspended death sentence and will not be appealing the decision. I'd like to take this opportunity to apologise to those who died and were hurt in the blasts, their families and all the citizens of the nation.
Thank you for that, Mr. Yu. That's all for today. Tune in next time.